Analysis and activism is both a perspective and a project, and it will be always a project. Being a project, analysis and activism is something unaccomplished. Yet this is not a weakness, it is a strength, because as a project, analysis and activism is much more the expression of questions than definitive solutions. Questions that arise from problems and from differences. In fact, it seems to me much more important to learn how to disagree well, how to conflict well, than how to agree. What John Gower expressed as bellica pax. The dream, the Pentecostal dream, would be to create a space in which everyone speaks his own language and everyone understands each other. Maybe this could be the description of analysis and activism as a project. What is perhaps more complex is to describe the nature of its perspective. As analysts, we deal with what we call the unconscious, which, by the way, had many other names in the past and elsewhere. The unconscious is what we do not perceive, understand, what we do not know. Now, there is a space for understanding that belongs to the specific individual. Then there is a space for the dyad, the I-thou structure, like mother and child, analyst and patient, lover and loved one. Then there is a space for the triad, a very important space in which transcendent values appear. These spaces have been relentlessly explored by analytical psychology or psychoanalysis. But in fact, any space for understanding, for consciousness, may be seen as a psychosocial space, from what we call transference all the way to the mass movements studied by psychologists and sociologists. What I want to say is that any process for understanding and any meaning that may emerge happen within our social, anthropological, and therefore also political environment. The typical analytical setting, two persons in a room, makes sense only if the participants acknowledge their own psychosocial nature and the psychosocial nature of their encounter, and the direct impact on their psyche of its power structures, its value system, its language, and its constraints. The idea that psychological understanding has to do with a naked subject, a person whose social specificity are not really relevant, is an illusion, partly produced by distorted privatization of what was once public and vice versa. Perhaps the most concise way to describe analysis and activism, as I see it, is through Martin Buber's words when he wrote, "One must begin with oneself, but not end with oneself." As this doesn't happen, if this does not happen, if we privatize what is public, what it is social and historical, and remain engrossed only into our private story, there is no real cure, no real understanding, no individuation. Hence, we will be still caught in an unconscious predicament. What will remain unconscious will be precisely the awareness and the full creative, ethically responsible participation into our eco-anthropological world. We would risk to remain caught in just a narcissistic, self-engrossed exercise based on the illusion that the other persons are not our complements, but just our instruments. The illusion that my life is really mine, that I am the titanic hero of my private myth. On the contrary, Buber's not finishing with oneself will include into the subject the social, anthropological, political water in which we all live, the only real water that exists. And in so doing, it will place the subject in the world once again. It is difficult to express how much the attempt to understand, to help some of my clients that are migrants or refugees, the others, as Papadopoulos says, helps me to understand myself. Not finishing with myself implies like a Möbius strip path through which I find myself in the other and vice versa. In a way, I become a community. The difficult thing is doing it not through a sociological perspective, because sociologists already do it very well, but as psychologists, therefore taking into account the psychosocial dynamics inside out as fundamental components of the individual, as is inner sociology, as Tom Singer says. Think of the language I'm speaking now, and of the fact that I'm speaking this language, which is not my native language. Both factors transcend me. I did not make this language, and I had to use it if I wanted to be understood by many. So also who I am and what I'm doing exactly now is an emergence of both my individual specificity together with the language it uses to express itself. In this case, a language that it is not mine, that it is not privately owned, not in one, but in two senses. Analysis and activism tries to look at the same time for the sociology within our psyche and the psychology within the social group's dynamics. These are two expressions of the same psychological, psychosocial, internal, external reality, in a way, a complexio oppositorum. Here, Jung's theory of introversion and extroversion makes very much sense. I often quote Toby Nathan, who says that a symptom is a text without a context, or I would add, a text in the wrong context. In both cases, it is the context that defines how we may understand, give meaning, or subtract meaning to our human experience. And this context goes from our biological body all the way to our political world, and obviously to our ultimate home, our planet. In fact, do we really think that bulimia, depression, ADHD, or today's pervasive symptoms of anguish are just biological, or that they have just to do with parents imagined as suspended in a non-historical social anthropological vacuum, an abstract, culturally uprooted image of the family? Or from the other complementary perspective, how can we not see that the whole capitalist structure, with its extreme destructive neoliberal consequences, is the colossal expression of one single emotion, greed? How can we not see that, more generally, political movements are not just sociological, as they are the expression of our fundamental human needs and hopes? Here, sociology and psychology merge. Up to now, I briefly spoke about the perspective that has to do with the analysis part. Let me say a word about the activism part. If starting from me, I reach the other, and I do not do it in a desperately narcissistic, dependent way, as it is happening within the social media world today, with our infinite selfies and posts that make public our private sphere. If I really go towards the other, I was saying, this cannot happen but in a situation in which I do something with the other, for the other, or against the other. Going towards the other cannot mean just to mentally analyze, understand him or her from my seal tower. It means to do something. If an action with no thought is blind, a thought with no action is empty. We often presume that we have to think before we act. Yet sometimes we have to act in order to understand. As Paul Hadot wrote, in order to make light, sometimes you have to pedal. Now, within analysis and activism, this once again means acting specifically as analysts, not just as citizens. This means acting while holding the inside-out perspective that I mentioned before. Nothing becomes real if it is not eventually expressed into an action. And this doing includes language, includes saying something, because an action may be described generally as something, maybe a movement, a gesture, a word that has an implicit impact on the other, on the context. Perhaps after all, the aim of our project is to contribute to restore our communities what have become a solitary crowd made of massified subjects to their true psychosocial dimension, and to try to do it starting from the single members of these communities, from the single person, or from the small groups in which he or she exists. Once again, the only place where I can find and realize myself is in relation to what I am not, which is the others that make our social and political, local and global communities, the others that paradoxically I have to become. I think this is part of the meaning of analysis and activism. Yes.